John, this new ad is a lot more aggressive than what we have seen so far. Why is the campaign making this choice, and why now?
Well, I think there are two messages that this campaign, the Biden campaign, has to communicate. You're seeing both of them in this ad. Number one, that Donald Trump is unfit for the presidency. And number two, that Joe Biden is actually working to get things done for the American public. That's their wording. But I think it would be political malpractice for Joe Biden's campaign to leave Donald Trump's convictions on the table and not go after them. Number one, the Biden base is going to be energized by that. It's going to get them excited. They've been waiting to see their candidate get a little tougher. And in order for Joe Biden to win over persuadable voters, and we have not seen this movement yet, he's going to have to make the case that Donald Trump's convictions, in the criminal court and with the finding of liability for sexual assault are something that independent voters make a decision on. Obviously, it's not the only thing they're going to make a decision on. The economy is number one, according to voters of all categories and classes. But this is part of the argument Biden needs to sell to those persuadable voters, that they simply don't want a convicted criminal in office. All of the things that he says in that ad, all the things that his campaign says in that ad are true about Donald Trump, which makes it unusual for a political ad.
Yamiche, this ad is titled Character Matters. But Donald Trump's character has never mattered to any of his voters, not since the day he went down the escalator in Trump Tower.
Well, what's interesting here is that the Biden campaign is really trying to appeal to the persuadable voters that Jonathan was just talking about. This isn't about obviously appealing to the people who were excited when Donald Trump came down the escalators and said a number of things that people found to be reprehensible about immigrants, about other Americans across this country. They're trying to get to the voters that maybe are still looking at this race and saying, well, I'm not sure who I want to go with. And I've talked to a lot of those voters. Some of them are so-called double haters, people that we've really talked to who don't really want to see a rematch at all. But when you sort of dig in with those voters, it comes down to, well, which one of these people do I like the least? And that's probably not going to be the person that I'm pushing. So here you have President Biden making the case about the economy, but also really not just talking about the criminal convictions, but also talking about the idea that Donald Trump has been found liable for sexual assault, the idea that he had financial fraud in his background, really trying to tear at the character, not just of the fact that he's a convicted or will be a convicted felon if he's sentenced and when he's sentenced, but also that he's someone who has sort of sold what they would consider to be the Biden campaign to be a lie, that he's a good businessman, which is what you hear still from a lot of voters who are interested in Donald Trump, or even people who are undecided are still saying, well, Donald Trump's good with business. Here's Joe Biden trying to make that argument. So this is really something, I think, to appeal to the people that are still on the fence, even as we're getting closer and closer to the election, Stephanie.
I'll make that correction for them. Donald Trump, personally and professionally, is not a good businessman. But for certain business people, they believe he is going to provide them with policies that they like for their business. But all of them know he is not a successful business person. Charles, you heard Jimmy Kimmel say at the end of that clip, this is the most important thing. And he was talking about the Supreme Court, where the president is urging people to understand that Trump in a second term could choose 2 more Supreme Court justices that are conservative, giving them a supermajority on the highest court in the land for a generation. Can you help us what that would mean? Help us understand what that would mean for our country.
Well, Stephanie, conservatives have figured out how to weaponize the Supreme Court and the judiciary to enact their agenda pretty much at every level. And so when you're talking about things like the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, for example, the only way that that has actual teeth, even if Democrats in Congress seek to legislate against it, is if the Supreme Court and other people on the bench are going to uphold that as law, if they're going to allow that to take place. And so when you talk about extending the already conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, that's what that looks like. It becomes a weapon for the right to enact this agenda and to remain ironclad regardless of what Congress does. So this is why this is so important. I think Jimmy Kimmel was right in terms of bringing that up, because what you're talking about is giving the teeth to the actual ideas, the ideology of what we're seeing from the right, and making it able to survive in a way that's very problematic. And if the Supreme Court even tips further toward the right in a conservative way, we could be in big trouble.
John, the Supreme Court is not a typical kitchen table topic for most voters, but obviously the impact of a Supreme Court that's that conservative for the foreseeable future is huge. How does the president get the American voter to understand that?
Yeah, this is very much an issue for the Biden base. It is something that I think those persuadable voters we've been talking about in swing states are going to pay a little bit less attention to. We heard a little bit of hyperbole there, I think, from the president saying that the Supreme Court is the most out of kilter that it's ever been. We can think in history of some pretty terrible Supreme Court decisions, whether you're talking about Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, on and on and on. But I think the president's point here that whoever is elected president may have an opportunity to make one or more selections. And of course, we don't know, what the future is for Samuel Alito or Clarence Thomas. Both of them younger
They'll
than,
be fine.
than Joe Biden.
Hold on, John.
But what I mean by that is we don't know that they're necessarily going to retire. We don't know if other justices might retire. It could be 0, it could be 9. But the point Joe Biden is making, and Stephanie, I'm sorry to have cut you off there, but the point Joe Biden is making is salient with Democratic voters, which is that they have seen what the Supreme Court has done since Donald Trump made his 3 appointments, including the repeal or the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and many other decisions that they don't like, whether you're talking about the bump stock ban that got overturned or you're talking about some very pro-business decisions that this court has made.